A dead man's watch should not tick. But in a small, silent apartment, 3 years after a funeral, a broken pocket watch on a shelf trembled once. Then twice. Then a voice spoke from inside it. The voice of a brother who had been dead for years, describing, in perfect calm detail, the exact moment his own heart stopped beating on the floor of a tower most of humanity would never see. That voice belonged to a man the world would later call the demon masked, a man who farmed his own strength down to zero, over and over, just so he could climb higher than anyone thought possible. A man who would one day rip a god's weapon out of the sky and watch it turn into chains wrapped around his arm. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, he was just a soldier standing in a quiet room, staring at his dead brother's watch, wondering why it had just spoken his name. To understand how he got there, the story has to go back. Back past the tower, past the masks and the executions, back to a funeral that should have been the end of his family's grief, and turned out to be only the beginning. His name was Yeon-woo. 3 years earlier, he had been a soldier stationed in Africa, the kind of man other soldiers trusted with the jobs nobody wanted. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. Command had a word for people like him, cold-blooded, and they meant it as praise. In the field, that coldness kept his squad alive more than once. It didn't help him at his mother's funeral. He stood at the edge of the grave in a stiff black suit, rain soaking through his shoulders, and felt almost nothing. Not because he didn't love her, because grief, for him, had always arrived late, like a wound that doesn't hurt until hours after the cut. What he did feel, standing there, was the absence beside him. His twin brother should have been at that funeral. Should have been standing on his left, the way he always had at every important moment of their lives. Instead, there was empty space, and a folded flag of a different kind. A small wooden box the family lawyer handed him after the service, saying it had been sent years ago, waiting for this day. Inside the box was a pocket watch, cracked glass, frozen hands, and underneath it, a leather diary, its pages soft from handling, filled with handwriting Yeon-woo would have recognized anywhere, his brother's. He hadn't seen that handwriting in years. Nobody had. His brother had vanished not long after their mother's diagnosis, chasing rumors of a cure that modern medicine couldn't offer. He'd told their mother he was going abroad for treatment research. He hadn't told her the truth, that the research was a tower, not a building, a place, a vertical world that stretched past the sky, filled with monsters, magic, and men strong enough to be mistaken for gods. A world where climbers competed for wealth, power, and rare cures no hospital on Earth could produce. His brother had gone in searching for a miracle to save their mother's life. Their mother had died anyway, slowly, quietly, still waiting for a son who never came home. And now, holding that watch in a rain-soaked cemetery, Yeon-woo finally opened the diary and understood why. The entries didn't read like adventure, they read like a slow unraveling. His brother had climbed with a guild called Ardia, built it from nothing into one of the tower's most respected names. He'd fought his way up floor by floor, gathered loyal friends, fallen in love with a woman named Vieira Dune. For a while, according to the diary, he'd actually believed he was close to the cure, close to going home. Then the entries changed. Whispers about outside pressure from the tower's great clans, doubts about people he'd trusted for years, a guildmate named Leonte growing colder, a mentor named Bahal asking questions that felt less like guidance and more like scouting. And finally, one entry, shorter than the rest, describing the night everything fell apart, the night his own guild turned on him, the night the woman he loved put a blade through his chest instead of standing beside him. The diary ended there, mid-sentence. Yeon-woo read it twice before he let himself feel anything. Then something in his chest, something that had stayed locked through years of combat and loss, finally cracked open. He sat on the floor of his empty apartment and cried the way he hadn't cried since he was a child. Not for his mother, not exactly, but for a brother who had spent his final months alone in a world nobody back home even knew existed, believing until his last breath that he had failed the one person he was trying to save. That grief lasted one night. By morning, it had turned into something colder and far more useful. Yeon-woo didn't know how his brother's body had been carried back to Earth. The diary never explained that part, only hinted, in one strange line, at an old dragon named Kalatus, who owed a debt he intended to repay. Whatever the truth was, it hadn't mattered as much as one simple fact. The tower was real, the entrance still existed, and the people who murdered his brother were still inside it, still alive, still climbing, still believing no one would ever come for them. They were wrong. The tower's entrance looked unremarkable from the outside, a door in an old building most people walked past without a second glance. Inside, it opened into something no camera back on Earth could have captured. A structure that seemed to swallow the horizon. Floor stacked on floor stacked on floor, disappearing upward into cloud and light that didn't belong to any normal sky. New climbers didn't start on floor 1. They started at what everyone called floor 0, the tutorial. A brutal 30-day trial split into blocks, labeled A through G, designed less to teach and more to filter out anyone who wasn't willing to bleed for a spot higher up. Most climbers who entered floor 0 came in as teenagers, trained for it since childhood, guided by families who'd sent generations into the tower before them. Yeon-woo walked in a week late, with no guild, no mentor, and no idea what half the terminology meant. On paper, he should have been hopelessly behind. He wasn't. He had 2 things nobody else in that tutorial had. First, his brother's diary, pages of first-hand knowledge about which trials were traps, which shortcuts existed, which mistakes had cost other climbers their lives. Second, a mind built by years of military conditioning, the kind of discipline that let him look at chaos and find the pattern inside it within seconds. He also had the watch. It didn't just hold his brother's voice anymore. Once he stepped inside the tower, the watch changed. The cracked glass smoothed, the frozen hands began to move, and it started functioning like a compass, pulling gently toward hidden paths and buried vaults most climbers never even knew existed. Sometimes, in tense moments, it did something stranger. It gave him flashes, brief, blurred glimpses of danger a few seconds before it happened. Not a full vision of the future, just enough warning to move first. He didn't tell anyone about any of it. From his very first hour on floor 0, Yeon-woo buried his identity behind a plain mask and a fake registration name. To the system, to the other climbers, to anyone watching the rankings, he was nobody. A late entry. A nobody chasing scraps. That was exactly how he wanted it. The tutorial ran on a currency called karma, earned by clearing trials and defeating monsters, spendable on gear, skills, and something most climbers treated as a last resort: reset tickets. A reset ticket did one simple thing. It wiped a climber's physical stats back down to 0. Nobody sane used them voluntarily. Losing your strength gains after weeks of grinding felt like punishment, not a reward. Yeon-woo bought his first one on day 4. He'd found something in his brother's notes that almost every other climber missed, a quiet system rule buried in the fine print, where certain hidden stat bonuses only triggered the first time a threshold was crossed. Reset your stats, hit that threshold again, and the bonus triggered again. Most climbers were too proud, or too impatient, to throw away their progress on a theory. Yeon-woo had nothing to protect and everything to prove. He reset his stats, ground back up, reset again, and again, quietly stacking hidden rewards nobody else in floor 0 even knew existed. By the time other climbers were still fumbling through block B, Yeon-woo had farmed himself into a monster wearing the mask of a rookie. He kept his head down, watched, waited. And on the 5th day, in the middle of a scouting mission through block C, he found the first person who would matter to him inside the tower. Not an enemy, but a girl named Yule. She was younger than most climbers, thin, exhausted, clearly out of her depth, part of a scouting team led by a man named Arendon. Yeon-woo watched from a distance as the team moved through a monster-infested ruin, and he noticed something the others didn't seem to care about. Yule was always positioned at the back, always given the most exposed routes, always the first one pushed forward whenever the group needed a distraction. He recognized the shape of it immediately. She wasn't a teammate to them. She was bait, kept alive only because bait that could still walk was more useful than bait that couldn't. He didn't intervene at first. He told himself it wasn't his problem, that he hadn't come into this tower to save strangers. But when the team hit a trapped chamber, and Arandon's scouts shoved Yule directly into the trigger zone without warning her, something in Yeon-woo's chest, something that still remembered what it felt like to lose someone he should have protected, refused to just watch. He moved before he decided to. The trap chamber filled with spinning blades and collapsing floor panels, the kind of trial designed to kill anyone who hesitated. Yeon-woo was faster than hesitation. He crossed the room in seconds, pulled Yule clear of a blade that would have opened her throat, and put himself between her and the rest of the collapsing mechanism until it finally stopped grinding. Arendon's team stood at the entrance, stunned, not relieved, calculating. When the dust settled, one of the scouts, the team's second, a broad man with a scarred jaw, stepped forward and tried to spin the moment into something usable. He apologized to Yule with a performance of guilt so smooth it would have worked on someone who hadn't just watched him shove her into a death trap minutes earlier. He said the room's trigger must have malfunctioned. He said they were lucky the stranger had been passing by. He reached out like he meant to pull Yule back into the group, back under his control. Yeon-woo stepped between them before the man's hand closed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told the man, flatly, that a system malfunction didn't explain 3 separate scouts stepping aside the second before the trap triggered. He told him that people who used others as tools rarely bothered hiding it well, and that Yule deserved better than an apology built entirely to protect the people who'd endangered her. Then, with a motion too fast for the scout to fully track, Yeon-woo's blade came down and cleanly severed the hand still reaching toward her. The scout screamed, his team scattered, more afraid of the masked stranger than loyal to their leader. Yule stood frozen, staring at the man who had just, without hesitation, done what none of her so-called allies ever had. Yeon-woo didn't offer comfort in the way most people would. He didn't promise her safety or protection. He simply told her, in the same flat tone he'd used on her attacker, that a hidden garden existed deep in a region called Prisia, a quiet place where certain elemental spirits still lingered, forgotten by climbers chasing faster power. He told her it might be worth her time if she ever wanted power that didn't depend on people like Arendon. It was a small thing, a single piece of advice, dropped and then walked away from. Yeon-woo had no idea, in that moment, how far that one sentence would carry her. He continued alone after that, deeper into Floor Zero's trials, farming his stats down and back up with cold, patient repetition, while the rest of the tutorial's climbers ground forward the ordinary way. Word started to spread about a masked rookie who'd humiliated one of Arendon's scouts, but nobody connected the rumor to a real threat. A late entry with a lucky blade, most assumed. Nothing more. That underestimation was exactly the gap Yeon-woo intended to live inside. Deeper into the tutorial trials, he found a sealed dungeon most climbers avoided entirely. A place called the Sanctuary, rumored to house something too dangerous for a group his apparent rank to survive. He went in alone anyway. Inside, a massive red centipede coiled through the ruins, its bite carrying a toxin strong enough to shut down a body from the inside in minutes. Yeon-woo's dragon eyes, the sharpened, analytical sight his brother's notes described in detail, let him read the creature's attack patterns almost as fast as it moved, but reading a pattern and surviving it were different things. The centipede caught him once, hard enough to fracture bone along his ribs, pain flooding through him in a wave he forced himself to breathe through instead of react to. He didn't retreat. He used the injury, let the creature commit to a final lunge it thought would finish him, and drove his blade up through the gap in its underside the moment it overextended. It took everything he had left to hold the strike steady as the creature thrashed and finally went still. Past its corpse, a swarm of blue ants poured out from a cracked wall, and Yeon-woo, already bleeding, already exhausted, didn't have the patience left to fight them individually. He drew on an unstable flask of alchemical fire from his brother's old supply notes and detonated the entire swarm in one motion, the blast singeing the edge of his coat and rattling his ears with a ring that took minutes to fade. At the center of the ruin, past broken statues and collapsed shrine walls, he found what the dungeon had been protecting, a curved black dagger etched with faint red veins, humming faintly even at rest. His brother's notes named it once, in a margin scribble, the vampiric dagger, rank 66, a blade capable of drinking strength directly from whatever it cut. He didn't celebrate. He wrapped his ribs as best he could, pocketed the blade, and kept moving. Because Floor Zero didn't pause for injuries, and neither did he. Word of a masked rookie clearing the sanctuary alone finally cracked through the noise of the tutorial. Most climbers dismissed it as exaggeration. A pair of high-ranking rookies did not. Their names were Khan and Doyle, both already respected inside Block D, both curious enough to seek the stranger out instead of ignoring him. They found him resting near the edge of a scorched clearing, still favoring his cracked ribs, and made him an offer instead of a challenge, a temporary alliance to raid the lair of a monster called the Lizard King, A target too dangerous for either of them to take alone, but potentially manageable for three. Yeon-woo agreed, not out of trust, but calculation. Numbers mattered against a target like that, and the diary's notes on the Lizard King's territory were thin. The raid didn't go cleanly. The Lizard King kept its young close, using them as shields the moment the fight turned against it, forcing the group into an ugly choice between pressing the attack and risking the hatchlings, or losing their advantage entirely. Yeon-woo solved it the way he solved most problems in that tower, coldly. He used captured firebugs to create a controlled panic among the hatchlings, pulling them toward a side tunnel and away from the fight, buying Khan and Doyle the opening they needed to land the finishing blows without slaughtering anything that hadn't chosen to be there. When the Lizard King finally fell, Yeon-woo absorbed a skill from its corpse that his brother's notes had flagged as rare even among high rankers. A flame infusion technique that let him channel raw heat directly through his blade, instead of relying on external fire. Khan and Doyle didn't ask many questions about who he really was. Rookies who cleared what he'd cleared rarely got interrogated. They simply noted, quietly, that whoever the masked stranger really was, he was going to be a problem for someone eventually. They had no idea how right they were. Not long after, deeper in the tutorial's outer zones, Yeon-woo stumbled onto something that had nothing to do with monsters or dungeons. A black market operation hidden beneath an abandoned trial site, using low-level climbers as decoys to lure desperate people into ambushes, then selling their bodies to alchemists who needed raw human material for experimental potions. It was the kind of quiet, profitable cruelty that thrived in places where nobody powerful bothered to look down. Yeon-woo looked down. He spent 2 days tracking the ring's movements, learning their rotation, their meeting points, the names of the scavengers running it. Then he ended it the same way he ended most things, quickly, without a trial, without mercy for people who had built a business out of feeding the desperate to monsters. The scavengers who thought they'd set a clever trap for a lone masked rookie instead found themselves outmatched by senses sharper than anything they'd accounted for, cut down before most of them even understood the ambush had flipped. None of it made the tutorial's official rankings. None of it needed to. Yeon-woo wasn't climbing for recognition. He was climbing for a list of names buried in his brother's diary, and every trial he cleared, every skill he absorbed, every reset he cycled through, brought him one step closer to standing in front of the people on that list. By the final stretch of Floor 0, at the edge of Block G, the last stage of the tutorial waited. A leaderboard challenge dominated for weeks by two names climbers had already started treating like royalty. Adora and Fante, siblings from the One-Horn tribe, both ranked in the top tier since the trial's opening day. Yeon-woo had spent the entire tutorial invisible, farming quietly while the rest of the tower's newest generation fought loudly for attention. That was about to change. The leaderboard at Block G worked on a simple, brutal principle. Whoever held the most accumulated tokens when the tutorial closed claimed Rank 1, and Rank 1 didn't just mean bragging rights. It meant priority access to the tower's higher floors, faster guild recruitment offers, and a reputation that followed a climber for years. Adora and Fante had held that position since the tutorial opened. Nobody had come close to challenging them. Yeon-woo had spent 30 days making sure nobody would see him coming. While other climbers spent their tokens on gear upgrades or minor stat boosts, Yeon-woo had been quietly hoarding his, cycling through farming runs most competitors dismissed as inefficient, stacking reward after hidden reward through his repeated resets. By the final day of Block G, he wasn't holding a modest surplus. He was sitting on a number large enough to break the leaderboard's entire scale. He walked into the ranking hall the way he'd walked through the rest of the tutorial. Unremarkable, masked, easy to overlook. Climbers packed the room, watching a massive display track the final hours before Floor 0's gates closed. Adora stood near the front with her brother, calm and composed, the kind of confidence built from 30 days of uncontested dominance. Yeon-woo stepped up to the registration terminal and dumped his entire token reserve in a single transaction. The display didn't just update, it broke its usual smooth animation and jumped, numbers spinning too fast to track before settling on a total that dwarfed everyone else's by a margin that silenced the room. A rookie nobody had ranked in the top 100 had just buried the leaderboard's reigning champions under a wave of tokens they couldn't hope to match with hours left on the clock. Fante was the first to react, and he reacted the way most people underestimated eventually did, with disbelief curdling fast into anger. He crossed the hall directly toward Yeon-woo, demanding to know who he was. accusing him of exploiting some system glitch, because no legitimate rookie could have farmed that number without anyone noticing. Yeon-woo didn't raise his voice. He told Fonte, simply, that nobody had noticed because nobody had been watching someone they'd already decided didn't matter. Adora didn't shout. She studied him instead, the way a genuinely dangerous person studies an unknown threat, and something about the stillness behind his mask unsettled her more than her brother's anger did. She asked, calmly, what he intended to do with a rank he clearly hadn't fought for in the traditional sense. He told her the truth, or close enough to it. He said rankings didn't interest him. Access did. Fonte didn't accept that answer. He challenged him on the spot, right there in the ranking hall, demanding a duel to settle whether the new rank 1 had actually earned the strength to hold that position or had simply gamed a broken system. Yeon-woo accepted. The fight that followed wasn't long, but it wasn't easy either. Fonte fought with the trained precision of someone who'd spent his whole life preparing for exactly this kind of pressure, striking fast, reading angles, forcing Yeon-woo to actually work for every opening instead of coasting on farm stats alone. At one point, Fonte's blade caught him across the forearm, a shallow cut but a real one, proof that arrogance wasn't the only thing separating them. Yeon-woo absorbed the hit and used the opening it created, the watch on his wrist giving him a half-second flash of Fonte's next movement before it happened. He stepped inside the strike instead of away from it, closed the distance, and ended the exchange with his blade resting against Fonte's throat, before the younger man could reset his stance. He didn't kill him. He didn't need to. He simply held the position long enough for the entire hall to understand exactly how far above Fonte he really was, then stepped back and lowered his blade. Adora watched the whole exchange without a single word until it ended. Then she did something her brother clearly hadn't expected. She walked forward, past Fonte, and asked Yeon-woo directly, without hostility, who had trained him. He gave her nothing, just silence and a mask that revealed even less. That silence did something to her that a direct answer wouldn't have. It planted a question she couldn't stop turning over. Who was this man, appearing from nowhere, cold enough to dismantle the tutorial's leaderboard, and calm enough to spare her brother's life without a hint of pride about it? Yeon-woo left the ranking hall as rank 1, floor 0 technically behind him, and neither Adora nor Fonte had any idea they had just been outmaneuvered by someone with far larger targets than a tutorial leaderboard. Before the tutorial's gates fully closed, one detail from his brother's notes pulled him towards something most climbers never even found. A hidden vault, tucked behind a false wall deep in Block G's ruins, marked in the diary only as Olympus's reach. The watch practically dragged him there, its hands spinning with an urgency he hadn't felt from it before. Inside, the vault didn't look like a treasure room. It looked like a temple built for beings that had stopped caring what mortals thought of grandeur. At its center, a presence made itself known without a body attached to it. A voice, calm and layered with a weight that pressed against Yeon-woo's chest, identifying itself as Hermes. The god's offer was straightforward. Become his apostle, serve as a vessel and conduit for his power, and in exchange, gain a shortcut through years of ordinary growth. Yeon-woo refused. He didn't refuse out of pride. He refused because his brother's diary had one blunt warning scrawled beside any mention of apostleship, that binding yourself to a god meant binding your choices to that god's interests, permanently. Yeon-woo hadn't spent 3 years chasing vengeance just to hand his freedom to someone else's agenda. Hermes seemed almost amused by the rejection rather than insulted by it, and let him pass deeper into the vault without further interference. At the center of the chamber, resting on a cracked pedestal, sat the true prize the diary had marked. A shattered fragment of Zeus's thunderbolt, still humming faintly with power despite being broken. The moment Yeon-woo's hand closed around it, the fragment reacted violently, shattering fully in a flash of white light that knocked him backward. What emerged from that light wasn't a weapon. It was a set of chains, dark and impossibly cold, that shot forward and wrapped around his forearm before he could react, sinking into his skin like they belonged there. Pain tore through him, sharp enough to buckle his knees, and for a moment, a voice that wasn't his brother's, wasn't Hermes's, wasn't anything human, echoed somewhere behind his own thoughts. It called itself the Black King, and it didn't ask permission before settling into him. When the pain finally faded, the chains had vanished beneath his skin, leaving only a faint dark mark curling around his arm. Something ancient and terrifying had just attached itself to him, and even the tower's gods, watching from wherever gods watched, would come to fear exactly what that meant. Floor Zero closed behind him not long after. 30 days that had turned an unranked latecomer into a rookie carrying a god-slaying inheritance nobody could see and a rank 1 no one could explain. He stepped onto floor 11 without ceremony, without celebration, already reading his brother's notes for what came next. Floor 11's terrain was unlike anything in the tutorial. Sprawling forests that shifted color with the hour, ruins half swallowed by roots older than the tower's recorded history. Somewhere in those ruins, according to a page in the diary marked with unusual care, a mythological egg had been hidden centuries ago, guarded loosely enough that only a handful of high-ranking thieves had ever managed to locate it. A group of those thieves had found it recently. Yeon-woo's watch pulled him toward their hideout before they finished extracting it. He arrived in the middle of their attempt to crack the egg's outer shell, 5 armed climbers working in tense coordination around a golden, faintly glowing orb, roughly the size of a large melon. They noticed him too late to properly organize a defense. He moved through them with the same brutal efficiency he'd used on the scavenger ring, the vampiric dagger drinking strength from every clean hit, until only the egg remained, undamaged, cradled carefully in his arms. The moment he touched it fully, warmth spread up through his hands, gentle compared to the violence of Zeus's chains. A soft presence brushed against his mind, curious rather than hostile, and the diary's notes finally made sense of what he was holding, a legacy tied to the phoenix, a creature whose life flame could pass, under the right conditions, to someone willing to carry its spark forward. Days later, in a quiet clearing away from prying eyes, the egg finally cracked open. What emerged wasn't the towering mythic bird from old stories. It was small, fragile, feathers the color of dying embers, chirping with a sound that had no business belonging to a creature capable of rebirth. Yeon-woo, a man who had executed traffickers without hesitation and dismantled a leaderboard without blinking, found himself sitting on the forest floor, watching this tiny bird stumble around his boots, and felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since his mother's funeral. He named her Nike. Within days, everyone who saw her started calling her Chirpy instead, and he didn't bother correcting them. She became something the diary hadn't prepared him for. Not a weapon, not a tool, but company. A small, warm presence that curled up against his neck when he slept, and squawked indignantly whenever he forgot to feed her before feeding himself. The tribal enlightenment came shortly after, when a scouting patrol from the One-Horn tribe crossed paths with him deep in Floor 11's forest. Word of the masked rookie who'd humiliated their royal siblings back in Block G had already reached tribal ears, and rather than hostility, Yeon-woo found something closer to cautious curiosity waiting for him. The tribe's elders granted him access to a hidden archive buried beneath their central sanctuary, a place holding generations of accumulated knowledge about the body's internal meridians, pathways most climbers spent years failing to fully unlock. Yeon-woo spent 4 days inside that archive without leaving, without proper sleep, pushing his mind through information dense enough to break weaker focus entirely. By the end of it, his head ached in a way physical combat never caused, but 12 meridians that had sat dormant his entire life finally opened, and from that opening he pieced together a technique the archive's own records had never fully completed, something he called the wings of the sky. Adora found him afterward, sitting exhausted near the archive's entrance, and this time she didn't ask who trained him. She sat down beside him instead, quiet, and stayed there until he was steady enough to stand. Neither of them said much. It didn't need saying. Something had shifted between them, slow and unhurried, the kind of bond that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in anyway. Not long after, the tower's political undercurrents finally demanded his attention. A mercenary legion, 3,000 strong, had been contracted by forces aligned against the clans responsible for his brother's death. Command of that legion had fallen into chaos, its previous leader killed in a skirmish, its soldiers scattered and unwilling to follow anyone new. Yeon-woo took command. It wasn't a smooth transition. Soldiers who'd survived years in the tower didn't bend easily to an unfamiliar masked commander with no proven track record among them. He broke that resistance the only way he knew how, not through cruelty, but through relentless, exhausting proof. He fought beside them in the Legion's worst skirmishes, took the front line when lesser commanders would have hung back, and slowly, painfully, earned the kind of loyalty that couldn't be ordered into existence. By the time the Legion fully submitted to his command, he turned that loyalty into a weapon far sharper than any blade. He orchestrated a political kidnapping deep inside enemy territory, snatching a key official from one of the clans allied against him, and used the resulting chaos to trigger an internal revolution that tore the enemy's command structure apart from within. It was during that campaign, watching factions collapse under pressure he'd engineered from the shadows, that Yeon-woo felt the first real shift beneath his skin. A rival god, somewhere on the tower's higher floors, had just consumed the cores of 4 legendary beasts in a bid for ascension. The resulting magical shockwave rippled down through the tower's structure, and Yeon-woo, still carrying the dormant remnants of the immature dragon body his brother's notes had once mentioned in passing, found himself pulled into that shockwave's wake. Power surged into him that didn't belong to any single source. His frame locked rigid, bones cracking and reforming beneath skin that suddenly felt too tight, veins burning as something ancient and draconic clawed its way through his human shape. A system notification hung in his vision, climbing steadily toward completion, and by the time it hit 100%, the man his soldiers had followed into battle had become something else entirely. Not fully dragon, not fully human, something in between, with strength that made his previous ceiling look like a child's toy by comparison. His legion watched the transformation in stunned silence. Adora, present for the final stages of the campaign, didn't flinch away from what she saw. If anything, she moved closer, steady beside him the way she'd been steady outside the archive. With his legion secured, his draconic body settling into its new shape, and the political groundwork laid for the wars still coming, Yeon-woo finally turned his attention to the names that had brought him into this tower in the first place. Leonte, Bahal, Bild, Vieira Dune. His brother's diary had named them as friends once. Now they were nothing but debts waiting to be collected. He started with Bahal. Intelligence gathered through the Legion's networks placed Bahal on the front lines of a border skirmish, commanding a detachment expected to easily crush the resistance forces Yeon-woo had spent months building. Bahal had no idea the masked commander leading those resistance forces was connected to anyone he'd once called a student. Yeon-woo made sure he found out. He intercepted Bahal's detachment personally, cutting through lesser soldiers with brutal efficiency, until only Bahal remained standing amid the wreckage of his own command. Bahal recognized something in the way Yeon-woo moved, some echo of a fighting style he'd once taught, and demanded to know who he really was, voice cracking with a dawning horror he couldn't quite name yet. Yeon-woo didn't answer immediately. He let Bahal unleash everything he had first, a devastating fire technique called Rain of Fire, flames roaring hot enough to melt stone, the kind of attack Bahal had clearly used to end fights before they properly began. Yeon-woo walked through it. The flames licked against a body no longer entirely human, draconic resilience shrugging off heat that should have ended him instantly. Bahal's confidence cracked in real time, disbelief flooding his expression as the masked figure kept advancing, unburned, unbothered, closing the distance with slow, deliberate steps. At close range, Yeon-woo finally lifted his blade to eye level, angled just enough for Bahal to catch his own reflection in the metal, and beside it, for one brief instant, something that looked unmistakably like the face of the student Bahal had betrayed years ago. Bahal's mouth opened, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg, maybe just to ask how. Yeon-woo didn't let him finish forming the words. The blade came down clean, and Bahal's head hit the ground before the rest of him understood the fight was already over. Yeon-woo stood over the body for a long moment, breathing steady despite everything, then called forward the Shadow Legion his Soul Devour ability had been quietly building from every high-ranking enemy he'd consumed strength from since Floor Zero. Bahal's remaining soldiers, watching an army of dark, silent thralls rise from nothing at their commander's death, broke and scattered before Yeon-woo's forces even needed to press the advantage. One name crossed off his list. Word of Bahal's death spread through the tower's upper factions fast, faster than Yeon-woo had expected, and it didn't spread as a battlefield casualty. It spread as a warning. Somewhere out there, a masked stranger with terrifying strength was hunting specific people by name, and nobody yet understood the thread connecting the deaths together. Leonte understood it before most. He'd fought alongside Bahal for years, and when news of the execution reached him, something cold settled into his gut that he couldn't quite explain to the people around him. He doubled his personal guard. He started sleeping with a blade beside his bed. He told himself it was simple caution. He had no idea the reckoning coming for him would arrive from a direction he wasn't guarding at all, Because while Leonte fortified himself against a threat he still didn't fully understand, Yeon-woo had already turned his attention towards something far more ambitious than a single execution. Deep in his brother's diary, buried in the final pages before the entries stopped, there was a plan. Unfinished, incomplete, but unmistakably aimed at the very people who had orchestrated the betrayal from the shadows. A blueprint. A fake one. Designed to look exactly like the missing formula for something called the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary alchemical prize the Red Dragon faction had been chasing for years, desperate enough to kill for a genuine copy. Yeon-woo intended to hand them a fraudulent one. And at the head of the Red Dragon faction sat a figure the entire tower spoke of with a mixture of reverence and fear. An ancient, dying dragon known as the Summer Queen, whose failing health had made her faction more desperate, more paranoid, and more vulnerable than it had been in centuries. Yeon-woo's watch, still faintly warm against his wrist, pulled steadily toward her territory. The witches of Walpurgis Night were about to receive a gift they didn't know would poison everything they'd built. The Red Dragon faction didn't deal with strangers directly. That was the first problem Yeon-woo had to solve before his fake blueprint could reach anyone who mattered. He solved it through Hanova. The dwarf blacksmith had been close to his brother once, gruff and unsentimental on the surface, quietly grieving underneath it. When Yeon-woo first approached him, mask still in place, Hanova studied him for a long moment with narrowed eyes before setting down his hammer and asking flatly how a stranger had gotten his hands on a walking stance that belonged to a dead man. Yeon-woo removed the mask. Hanova didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he crossed the forge, gripped Yeon-woo by the shoulders hard enough to bruise, and demanded to know everything. How, why, what had happened to the boy he'd treated like a son for years. By the time Yeon-woo finished explaining, Hanova's hands were shaking, not from age, but from a grief that had been sitting unresolved since the day Artia's fall reached his ears secondhand. He didn't ask Yeon-woo to stop his campaign of vengeance. He asked how he could help. Hanova had connections into the black market alchemical trade that stretched deeper than most people realized. Old favors owed to him by desperate buyers who needed rare materials without asking questions. Through those connections, a rumor started circulating, quiet at first, then louder, that a partial blueprint for the Philosopher's Stone had surfaced, smuggled out of a dead alchemist's private vault. The Summer Queen's people took the bait within days. Yeon-woo made sure the blueprint looked authentic enough to survive scrutiny from anyone but the tower's most careful alchemists, and just flawed enough, in one critical structural detail, to guarantee catastrophic failure the moment someone tried to actually synthesize it. His brother's notes had described the real stone's mechanics in enough depth for Yeon-woo to understand exactly which flaw would cause the most damage. Not an explosion, but a slow, systemic corruption that would spread through anyone who consumed the finished product. The Summer Queen, dying and desperate for anything that might extend her failing life, purchased the blueprint through an intermediary without hesitation. It took 3 weeks for her alchemist to complete the synthesis. It took less than a day after that for the corruption to spread. The Red Dragon faction's central fortress sat perched above a valley of dead volcanic rock, its walls reinforced with generations of dragon-forged stone, its gates guarded by warriors who had never once considered the possibility of an internal collapse. Nobody there was prepared for what the poisoned stone actually did. It didn't kill instantly. It spread through bloodlines and magical channels first, corrupting the very source of the faction's draconic power from the inside, turning strength into sickness one silent hour at a time. By the time anyone realized what had happened, half the fortress's ranking warriors were already too weakened to properly defend the walls. Yeon-woo struck that same night. He didn't come alone. His Shadow Legion moved with him, silent and merciless, cutting through the fortress's outer defenses, while alchemical meteors, another gift from materials looted deep in the tower's earlier floors, rained down against the fortress's outer towers, turning stone to rubble and forcing the remaining defenders into chaotic retreat. The witches who served the Summer Queen's inner circle called that night Walpurgis Night, a name that would echo through tower history long after the fires finally went out. Yeon-woo moved through the burning fortress with a single purpose. He was hunting one person, and he wasn't going to stop until he found her. Viera Dune had heard the rumors of a masked killer working through the tower's upper factions, executing names connected to a guild called Artia one by one. She hadn't connected the dots fully, not until the night the fortress burned around her, and a familiar walking stance emerged from the smoke, carrying a blade she recognized from a life she'd tried very hard to forget. She ran. Vieira Dune had spent years cultivating contingencies exactly for a moment like this. A rare technique allowing her consciousness to transfer between prepared vessels, buying her time whenever a fight turned against her. She burned through 3 of those vessels that night, each transfer costing her precious seconds Yeon-woo used to close the distance further. He caught her on the 4th attempt, cornering her in a collapsing tower chamber with nowhere left to run. She didn't beg immediately. She tried reasoning first, her voice steady despite the fires roaring outside, insisting that everything that happened to Artia's founder had been complicated, that politics and survival had forced choices nobody wanted to make, that she'd loved him once, genuinely, before circumstances turned that love into something else. Yeon-woo let her finish, then he told her, in a voice as calm as the one she'd used, that he'd read every page of the diary, describing exactly how those complicated choices felt from the other side of her blade. He didn't kill her quickly. The vampiric dagger drank from her slowly, methodically, each cut designed less to end her and more to strip away every layer of composure she'd built over years of climbing the tower's political ladder. His shadow legions surrounded the chamber, cutting off every remaining escape route, and when she attempted one final desperate transfer to a backup vessel hidden outside the fortress, Yeon-woo's soul devour ability caught the transfer mid-motion and unraveled it before it could complete. She screamed then, finally, the composure cracking entirely. He ended it with a single motion across her throat, and as her body slumped against the burning wall, his shadow legion pulled her soul from the wreckage before it could scatter, grinding what remained of her essence down until nothing recognizable was left to salvage, transfer, or resurrect. One more name crossed off the list. The Summer Queen herself made her final stand outside the fortress's collapsing central spire. Her once mighty draconic form withered by both age and the poison Yeon-woo had engineered specifically to hollow her out from within. She recognized him for what he was the moment their eyes met. Not just a rogue killer, but the true successor to a bloodline she'd once trained and then discarded when politics demanded it. She didn't ask for mercy. Dragons rarely did. She unleashed everything her failing body had left, a final burst of flame and raw draconic pressure meant to take him down even in death. Yeon-woo met that final assault head-on, his own draconic form answering hers scale for scale, strength for strength, until her flames finally guttered out from exhaustion neither pride nor fury could sustain any longer. As she fell, Yeon-woo stepped forward and absorbed what remained of her flame essence directly, the last vestige of her power flowing into him instead of scattering uselessly into the ruins around them. The tower's system registered the shift immediately, a notification confirming what the burning fortress already made obvious. He had just become something the tower's records would start calling the Master of Souls. Adora arrived not long after the fires finally died down, moving through the wreckage with practiced calm despite the devastation surrounding her. She found Yeon-woo standing alone amid the ruins of a fortress that had ruled an entire faction for centuries, his mask cracked, his draconic features still faintly visible beneath the strain of everything he'd just done. She didn't ask him what happened. She'd already guessed enough of it from the rumors reaching her before she arrived. Instead, she simply stood beside him, quiet, steady, the same way she had outside the archive weeks earlier, letting her presence say what words would have made too fragile. With Vieira Dune and the Summer Queen both gone, and Bahal's death still fresh in the tower's collective memory, only 2 names from the original diary remained untouched: Bild and Leonti. Bild had gone into hiding the moment word of Bahal's execution reached him, retreating into a fortified stronghold in Arandan's territory, surrounded by alchemical defenses he'd spent years perfecting. He wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense. He'd always relied on his knowledge of forbidden alchemy to give himself an edge nobody else could match. That knowledge, ironically, was about to be his undoing. Yeon-woo's intelligence network, built through the loyalty of his mercenary legion and reinforced by Hanova's black market contacts, eventually traced a critical weakness inside Bild's stronghold, an informant embedded deep in Arandan's organization, feeding information about troop movements and defensive schedules to outside buyers for profit. Yeon-woo found the informant first. The confrontation was brief. Yeon-woo didn't need details beyond confirmation of the man's betrayal to justify what came next, and the informant, recognizing too late exactly who had cornered him in a rain-soaked alley outside Arandan's walls, didn't survive long enough to sell anyone else out. With the informant's knowledge in hand, Yeon-woo breached Arendon's stronghold directly, cutting through its outer guard with the same efficiency that had become his signature since Floor Zero. Deep inside, past layers of alchemical traps designed to protect Build's research, he found something that stopped him cold despite everything he'd already seen that night. A flesh lab. Rows of captive test subjects, kept alive and conscious, used as raw material for experimental alchemical processes Build had been running for years to perfect a stone capable of granting him power beyond his natural limits. Yeon-woo freed every soul he could reach that night. Some of the captives were too far gone to save physically, their bodies broken beyond recovery, but his soul devour ability let him at least pull their trapped essences free from the machinery, keeping them tethered to suffering instead of death. Build found him standing amid the wreckage of his own life's work, and unlike Bahal, he didn't bother pretending confusion about who Yeon-woo really was. He'd suspected for weeks. He simply hadn't believed the threat would arrive before his own research reached completion. He tried to finish it anyway, forcing down an unstable prototype stone in a desperate bid for the power he thought would let him survive the confrontation. The stone reacted violently inside him instead, the flawed alchemical process he'd rushed for years finally catching up with him all at once. His heart mutated grotesquely beneath his skin, veins bulging black as the failed stone tore through his body from the inside. He didn't die from Yeon-woo's blade. He died screaming on the floor of his own laboratory, undone entirely by the same forbidden shortcuts he'd used to betray a friend years earlier. Yeon-woo watched it happen without intervening, and when it was finally over, he turned his attention to the ruined lab's remaining records, searching for anything connected to the final name on his list. That search turned up something the diary had never mentioned, something that stopped him harder than Build's death ever could. Buried in Build's private files were records of a child, kept hidden and monitored for years under a cover identity, her lineage carefully obscured through falsified documentation. Yeon-woo almost dismissed it as unrelated until he found a blood sample analysis attached to the file, cross-referenced against genetic markers that matched, unmistakably, his own family line. He found her 3 floors deeper, in a secondary facility Build had used as a fallback location. A frail girl, malnourished and frightened, kept in captivity for reasons the records only partially explained. Her name was Sasha. Yeon-woo didn't need the paperwork to know what he was looking at. Something in her face, in the shape of her eyes, matched a photograph he'd carried since his mother's funeral, a photograph of his brother at roughly the same age. His brother had a daughter nobody in the diary had ever mentioned, hidden away and monitored like a liability instead of raised like family. Yeon-woo broke the chains holding her without a word, and when she flinched away from him, terrified of another stranger in a mask, he removed it, letting her see a face that mirrored the one photograph she apparently still carried, folded inside a scrap of fabric tied around her wrist. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said the only word that mattered, quiet and disbelieving, asking if he was really her father. Yeon-woo told her the truth. He wasn't her father. He was her uncle, carrying her father's face and her father's unfinished business, and he wasn't going anywhere without her. She started crying before he finished the sentence, and this time, unlike the night he'd read the diary alone in his apartment, he didn't try to hold his own reaction back. He knelt down in the ruins of a stranger's flesh lab and held his brother's daughter for the first time, feeling something settle into place that vengeance alone had never managed to fill. Sasha wasn't alone in that facility either. Deep in an adjoining chamber, Yeon-woo found a woman restrained by heavier chains, dragon-blooded based on the faint scales visible along her collarbone, unconscious and unresponsive even after he broke her free. Records identified her as Ananta, Sasha's mother, kept sedated for reasons the files didn't fully explain. When she finally woke days later, in the safety of Hanova's forge, she remembered almost nothing. Not her own name, not the years leading up to her captivity, not even Sasha's face at first. Whatever had been done to her inside that facility had taken more than her freedom. It had taken her memory along with it. Yeon-woo didn't push her to remember. He simply made sure both she and Sasha had somewhere safe to stay, protected by people who had loved his brother enough to extend that love toward the family he'd left behind. Galliard, the dark elf who had once trained his brother in spatial techniques, took to Sasha almost immediately once she arrived at Hanova's forge. His usual sharp, guarded demeanor, softening into something closer to a grandfather's patience whenever she was nearby. He'd lost a student he'd cared for deeply. Watching that student's daughter laugh for the first time in weeks, safe and fed and no longer chained to a laboratory wall, seemed to fill some of that loss without erasing it. Leonte, the last name on the original list, didn't stay hidden as effectively as Bild had. Word of Sasha's rescue and the fall of Bild's stronghold finally forced him into the open, desperate to consolidate whatever remaining allies he had left before Yeon-woo's reach closed in around him too. That desperation pulled him into contact with the tower's higher powers, seeking protection from forces beyond simple faction politics. It was around this time that gods and demons who had largely stayed out of mortal affairs started paying closer attention to the masked figure systematically dismantling one of the tower's most established power structures. Poseidon noticed first. The sea god's territory occupied Floor 30, a vast oceanic domain where Triton, his most trusted apostle, maintained control over a series of coastal outposts that fed resources up through the tower's higher factions. Poseidon had no direct stake in Leonte's survival, but he had significant stake in making sure no mortal climber grew powerful enough to threaten the established order gods like him depended on. Yeon-woo's path toward Floor 30 wasn't originally about Poseidon at all. His pursuit of Leonte led him directly through Triton's territory, where the fleeing traitor had sought refuge under the sea god's protection, believing divine backing would finally be enough to stop the masked killer's advance. It wasn't. Yeon-woo breached the coastal outposts using a toxic blood mist technique adapted from lessons buried deep in his brother's notes. A slow, spreading corruption that dissolved Triton's defensive structures from the inside without requiring a direct confrontation with every guard stationed there. By the time Triton himself engaged directly, half his outposts had already fallen silent. Triton's apostle, a warrior named Benteke, met Yeon-woo personally at the edge of a collapsing seawall, confident in a fighting style built entirely around underwater combat that gave him an overwhelming advantage in Poseidon's domain. For a while, that confidence seemed justified. Benteke's control over the surrounding water forced Yeon-woo into constant defensive repositioning, unable to find a clean opening through the currents constantly shifting around him. The watch gave him the opening currents couldn't hide. A flash of foresight, brief and precise, showed him the exact half-second Benteke intended to commit to a finishing strike aimed at his chest. Yeon-woo let the strike come, twisted at the last possible instant, and used Benteke's own momentum to drive the apostle's blade backward through his own chest instead of Yeon-woo's. Benteke's confident expression didn't have time to fully register betrayal before his body went still in the water. Poseidon didn't take his apostle's death quietly. The sea god manifested directly, his presence flooding the entire coastal region with pressure heavy enough to crush ordinary climbers where they stood. His rage aimed squarely at the mortal who had just killed one of his most trusted servants. Yeon-woo stood his ground against a god's full manifestation, and for the first time since claiming his draconic body, he genuinely wasn't certain he could win a straight fight against an opponent operating on this scale. He didn't have to find out alone. The chains bound to his arms since the vault on Floor 0 flared to life, and through some connection Yeon-woo still didn't fully understand. A rift tore open in the sky above the battle. Figures descended through it, divine and half-divine alike. Athena's calm, tactical presence, Hermes moving with the same amused confidence he'd shown back in the vault, and a third figure whose chaotic, almost unstable energy identified itself only as Agaras. Together, their combined power tore into Poseidon's manifestation, shredding the arm he'd extended toward Yeon-woo before the sea god could complete whatever attack he'd intended. Poseidon retreated rather than risk further losses, his manifestation collapsing back into the ocean depths with a final, furious promise that this confrontation wasn't finished. Yeon-woo didn't know exactly why gods like Athena and Hermes had chosen to intervene on his behalf. Beyond the vague sense that the Black King's chains carried influence, he was still only beginning to understand. He filed the question away alongside the dozens of others his brother's diary had never answered, and turned his attention back toward finishing what he'd started. Leonte, watching Poseidon's forces scatter from a hidden vantage point along the coast, finally understood there was no protection left strong enough to shield him. He fled deeper into the tower's higher floors, dragging what remained of his loyalty and resources with him. Buying himself a temporary reprieve, Yeon-woo fully intended to end soon. That reprieve didn't last through the night. Sasha's condition worsened before it improved. Whatever had been done to her during her captivity in Bild's facility hadn't just left her malnourished. It had damaged something deeper, a slow deterioration in her body's connection to the magical energy every tower resident depended on to stay healthy. Hanova's forge had healers on call, skilled ones, but none of them could fully diagnose what was actually failing inside her. Yeon-woo watched her grow weaker over the following weeks despite every resource he threw at the problem, and for the first time since claiming his draconic body, he felt genuinely powerless against something. Strength didn't help here. Blades didn't help. His Shadow Legion couldn't fight an illness with no clear enemy behind it. It was Galliard who finally suggested reaching out to an old contact, someone he described only as an ancient presence who'd occasionally help desperate cases when the tower's conventional healers failed. He warned Yeon-woo the price for that help was rarely simple. The presence that answered their call didn't introduce himself with a name at first, just a quiet, steady voice that filled the room like warm static. When Yeon-woo finally asked who he was speaking to, the being paused before answering honestly that even he wasn't entirely certain anymore, offering only the name Bram, and admitting the fuller truth of his own identity had faded somewhere across centuries of quiet existence. He examined Sasha without touching her, his presence washing over her small frame like a slow tide, and after a long, heavy silence, he confirmed what Yeon-woo had feared. Her body was rejecting the magical corruption still lingering from her captivity, and without direct intervention, that rejection would eventually overwhelm her entirely. Yeon-woo asked what it would cost to save her. Bram didn't answer with numbers or conditions. He simply said that some costs weren't meant to be negotiated, only accepted, and asked Yeon-woo to trust him enough to step outside while he worked. Yeon-woo didn't trust easily. He stepped outside anyway, because refusing wasn't an option he could live with. What happened in that room over the following hours, nobody outside it fully witnessed. When Bram finally emerged, something about him looked diminished, his presence thinner than it had been before, like a candle burned down closer to its base. Sasha slept peacefully behind him, her breathing steady for the first time in weeks, color returning to her face in a way medicine alone hadn't managed. Yeon-woo asked him directly what he'd given up to make that happen. Bram admitted, quietly, that Sasha wasn't tied to him by blood, that his connection to her came purely from something closer to choice than obligation. He said he'd decided somewhere during those hours in that room that a girl who'd survived what she'd survived deserved a fuller life more than he needed whatever remained of his own divine reserves. He'd given her a portion of his own life force, permanently, to stabilize her failing connection to the world. Yeon-woo didn't fully understand the scale of that sacrifice until weeks later, watching Bram's presence grow noticeably weaker each time they spoke, a god slowly trading away pieces of himself for a child he'd chosen to love, without needing a reason beyond her survival. Sasha, once she was strong enough to understand what had happened, started calling him grandfather, without anyone suggesting it. Bram never corrected her either. With Sasha stable and safe, Yeon-woo's focus returned to the threads still unresolved, Leonte still hiding somewhere in the tower's higher floors, and Poseidon's promise of unfinished business hanging over everything like a blade waiting to fall. That blade fell sooner than expected, though not from the direction anyone anticipated. It happened while Yeon-woo slept. He'd pushed himself hard in the weeks following Sasha's recovery, running the Mercenary Legion's continued operations alongside his own hunt for Leonte, sleeping less than his body actually needed. During one of the rare nights he finally allowed himself real rest, something shifted inside him without his conscious awareness. The Black King's chains, dormant beneath his skin since the vault on floor 0, stirred. Azrael, a death god with a long-standing grudge against whatever entity had once been bound inside Zeus's shattered thunderbolt, had been tracking the chain's faint signature for weeks, patient in a way most gods rarely bothered being. He chose the moment of Yeon-woo's deepest sleep to strike, slipping past physical defenses that meant nothing to a being who existed partially outside normal space. What Azrael found waiting for him wasn't a sleeping mortal. The Black King's consciousness rose to meet him instead, taking control of Yeon-woo's body with an ease that suggested this wasn't the first time it had done exactly this. Where Yeon-woo fought with calculated precision, the Black King fought with something closer to ancient, patient cruelty, catching Azrael by the throat before the death god fully registered what he was actually facing. The battle that followed happened almost entirely in a space adjacent to normal reality, invisible to anyone physically nearby. Adora, sleeping in a room down the hall, felt something wrong in the air but couldn't identify what, and by the time she reached Yeon-woo's room, it was already over. Azrael's divinity didn't survive the encounter intact. The Black King tore through his defenses methodically, unraveling the threads of power that made him what he was, leaving behind something diminished and broken long before actually finishing him off. Yeon-woo woke the next morning with no memory of what had happened, only a faint, unsettling awareness that something significant had occurred while he slept, and a growing unease about exactly how much control he actually had over the power bound to his arm. He didn't get much time to sit with that unease. Word reached him soon after that Leonte, increasingly desperate, had made contact with a faction Yeon-woo hadn't anticipated, remnants of forces still loyal to the underworld, seeking protection from Hades himself in exchange for information about the masked killer's movements. That contact, ironically, opened a door Yeon-woo had been looking for without realizing it. Deep in his brother's notes, one final unresolved thread had remained largely mysterious throughout the diary's later entries. Repeated references to something called the Soul Stones, artifacts of immense power scattered across the tower's higher floors. Tied somehow to a broader conflict, the diary's author had clearly been building toward before his death cut the account short. Hades, it turned out, held pieces of that puzzle. Yeon-woo's path toward the underworld's gates led him through negotiations rather than combat, an unusual shift for a man who'd spent the better part of a year solving problems primarily with a blade. He summoned the soul of the eldest Cyclops brother, a being bound to the underworld through ancient debts, and offered a proposal instead of a demand. Hades' own weapon, an ancient blade known as Canine, had been shattered centuries earlier in a conflict the underworld god rarely spoke about directly. Yeon-woo offered his own skill with reforging techniques, learned partially from Hanova and partially from fragments in his brother's notes, to restore the weapon in exchange for information and, more specifically, safe passage into territories that would help him corner Leonte permanently. The Cyclops brother, initially skeptical of a mortal's ability to handle work that had defeated skilled underworld smiths for generations, eventually agreed to the arrangement after watching Yeon-woo demonstrate enough raw skill to make the offer credible. The reforging itself took weeks, careful and exacting work that demanded patience Yeon-woo hadn't needed to exercise since his early days farming stat resets in Floor Zero. Piece by piece, the shattered blade came back together under his hands, guided by techniques passed down through generations of underworld smiths who'd never expected to teach them to a mortal. While the work continued, Yeon-woo finally allowed himself something he'd been avoiding since his mother's funeral: a full accounting of everything he'd lost and everything he'd become in the process of avenging it. It happened one evening near the Phoenix's nesting grounds, where Nike had grown considerably since her hatching, no longer the fragile ember-colored chick from Floor 11, but something closer to a young, capable companion who still insisted on curling against his neck whenever he sat still long enough to allow it. Sitting there, watching her preen feathers that had grown brighter and stronger over the months, memory fragments he'd kept locked away finally broke loose. Childhood images surfaced without warning, his brother teaching him to fish before either of them cared about towers or gods, their mother's laugh before illness took the strength from it, the empty space beside him at her funeral that had started this entire nightmare. Yeon-woo, a man who had executed traitors without hesitation and dismantled a dying dragon's entire faction in a single night, dropped to his knees in the quiet grass and finally let himself grieve the way he hadn't allowed since that first night alone with the diary. He didn't hide it from anyone watching. Adora found him there partway through, and instead of offering hollow comfort, she simply sat beside him in silence, letting him break apart without trying to rush him back together too quickly. Nike pressed closer against his side, chirping softly, her small warmth doing more to ground him than words could have managed. It didn't fix anything permanently. Grief rarely worked that way. But something in him settled afterward. A weight shifted slightly, making room for a version of himself that wasn't defined entirely by vengeance. The Cyclops brother finally finished the reforging not long after, presenting Yeon-woo with a blade that hummed with restored underworld power, dark and cold in a way that matched the chains still bound to his arm. Hades himself appeared briefly to inspect the completed work, and though the underworld god didn't offer effusive gratitude, the respect in his tone when he acknowledged the craftsmanship was unmistakable. In exchange for Canine's restoration, Hades granted Yeon-woo passage through underworld territories that had, until then, remained closed to outside climbers, and with that passage came the location Yeon-woo had been hunting for months. Leonte had finally run out of places to hide. He'd taken refuge in a fortified sanctuary deep within territory nominally protected by underworld treaties, believing those treaties would shield him from outside pursuit. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that the person hunting him might negotiate directly with the god those treaties belonged to. The confrontation, when it finally came, lacked the drawn-out drama of Bahal's death or the brutal intimacy of Vieira Dune's execution. Leonte had spent months anticipating this moment, and when Yeon-woo finally stood before him, something in the traitor seemed almost relieved that the waiting was finally over. He didn't fight particularly hard. He offered a confession instead, admitting to details the diary had only partially captured, the extent of the political pressure that had turned Artia's inner circle against its founder, the specific moment he'd personally chosen greed over loyalty when a rival clan offered him resources beyond anything his own guild could provide. Yeon-woo listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he ended Leonte's life the same way he'd ended the others on his list, quick and final, without the theatrical cruelty he'd shown Vieira Dune but without mercy either. The list his brother's diary had started was finally complete. Yeon-woo stood alone afterward, in the quiet aftermath of a hunt that had consumed nearly a year of his life, and found the silence stranger than he'd expected. He'd built his entire existence since the funeral around finding and ending these specific people. Now that the last name was gone, the shape of what came next felt oddly undefined. That undefined space didn't stay empty long. Word reached him soon after that Lana, his brother's old master and one of the few people who genuinely mourned Artia's fall without benefiting politically from it, had died years earlier under circumstances the tower's records kept frustratingly vague about. Yeon-woo, carrying an underworld summoning technique learned partially through his dealings with Hades, made the decision to reach across that boundary and bring her back, if only briefly, for a conversation he suspected she deserved as much as he did. The summoning worked. Lana's spirit manifested in the quiet privacy of Hanova's forge, disoriented at first, then increasingly emotional as recognition set in. She'd spent whatever afterlife she'd occupied believing her favorite student had simply vanished, the details of his death never fully reaching her. When she finally understood who stood before her, wearing her student's face and carrying his unfinished legacy, she crossed the room and threw her arms around him without hesitation, tears falling freely as she held on like she genuinely believed, for just a moment, that he'd somehow come back from the dead himself. Yeon-woo let her believe it a little longer than strictly true, not out of cruelty, but because some griefs deserved a gentler landing than immediate correction. He told her everything eventually, his own story, his brother's fate, the year he'd spent hunting down everyone responsible. Lana listened without judgment, and when he finished, she told him something that hadn't appeared anywhere in the diary, a piece of context about the political pressure that had crushed Artia, details about factions and interests that reached higher than Leonte or Bahal, or even the Summer Queen had ever fully controlled. The betrayal, she explained, hadn't been purely personal. It had been engineered, at least partially, by interests connected to something called the Soul Stones, ancient fragments of divine power scattered across the tower generations ago, currently split among several great factions locked in an uneasy, temporary peace. That peace, Lana warned him, was already beginning to fracture. She didn't stay long after that conversation. Whatever mechanism allowed her spirit to manifest wasn't meant to last, and within hours she faded back toward wherever she'd come from, leaving Yeon-woo with a warmth he hadn't expected and a warning he couldn't ignore. The dragon factions, already destabilized by the Summer Queen's death and the collapse of her Red Dragon territory, had started fracturing along old loyalty lines nobody had properly settled since her passing. Multiple claimants to her remaining power and territory had begun positioning themselves for what increasingly looked like an inevitable civil war, each faction eager to claim whatever soulstones the Summer Queen's fall had left unclaimed. One name kept surfacing in every report reaching Yeon-woo about the conflict's shape, a figure known across the tower as the Gluttonous Emperor, a powerful, unpredictable force whose alliance could tip the coming war decisively in whichever direction he chose to lean. Before pursuing that alliance directly, Yeon-woo found himself pulled toward one final trial, buried deep in tower lore, and mentioned only briefly in his brother's notes as something worth attempting if the opportunity ever arose, a challenge called the Trial of the 72 Transformations. The trial existed inside a shifting, disorienting maze that responded directly to a climber's own mental state, designed originally, according to fragmented records, by a legendary figure connected loosely to old stories about a mischievous, transformation-capable warrior from tales predating the tower itself. Yeon-woo entered alone, sealing away every artifact and external advantage he carried, stripping himself down to raw perception and instinct the way the trial demanded. Inside, the maze twisted constantly, hallways rearranging themselves the moment his attention wavered, statues of stone monkeys shifting subtly whenever he looked away. Progress required him to notice 72 distinct physical transformations hidden across those statues, memorizing and replicating each subtle shift in posture before the maze would acknowledge his understanding and allow him deeper. It took days. His mind, already stretched thin from the meridian training back on floor 11, strained harder here than almost anywhere else he'd tested it. Pattern recognition pushed to its absolute limit against a puzzle designed specifically to punish anyone relying on brute force instead of patience. He finished it anyway, piecing together the final transformation on hands and knees in the maze's deepest chamber, exhausted beyond anything physical combat had ever demanded of him. The reward waiting at the center wasn't a weapon or a technique. It was a small, unassuming fragment of divine iron, warm to the touch, humming with an energy that felt distinctly different from anything else he'd absorbed throughout his climb. His brother's notes, cross-referenced against old tower legends, identified it eventually as a fragment connected to a legendary figure the stories simply called the Monkey King. What that fragment would eventually let him do, Yeon-woo didn't fully understand yet. He pocketed it anyway, trusting that his brother's instincts about what mattered had rarely been wrong. With the trial behind him, he finally turned his full attention toward the gluttonous emperor, understanding that securing an alliance with a figure of that unpredictable power would require more than a straightforward request. Intelligence gathered through his network suggested the emperor held a particular weakness for a rare, legendary liquor called hamished, brewed only in small batches by a reclusive distillery deep in the tower's lower floors, prized less for its taste and more for the rare ceremonial status attached to sharing it. Yeon-woo tracked down 2 full jars of it, no small feat given the distillery's notorious secrecy, and arranged a meeting through channels Hanova helped negotiate. The emperor received him with the kind of theatrical suspicion powerful figures often use to test unfamiliar allies, questioning his motives, his strength, his actual usefulness in a conflict that could easily consume factions far more established than a single masked climber's personal vendetta. Yeon-woo didn't oversell himself. He simply set the 2 jars of hamished liquor on the table between them and let the gesture speak first. The emperor's demeanor shifted almost immediately, genuine interest replacing performative skepticism, as he examined the jars with something close to reverence. Few outsiders bothered learning about a preference that specific, and fewer still managed to actually secure the genuine product instead of the counterfeit versions flooding lower-floor markets. Still, interest alone wasn't commitment, and the emperor made that clear, demanding proof of loyalty beyond a well-chosen gift before agreeing to commit his considerable forces to any alliance. Yeon-woo provided that proof through a fabricated account, carefully constructed and thoroughly credible, describing a recent skirmish where forces aligned with the Elohim clan had allegedly attempted to ambush Emperor-aligned territory under the cover of ongoing Dragon faction chaos. The account wasn't entirely fiction. Elohim scouts had genuinely been active in the region, but the specific ambush Yeon-woo described had never actually happened. It didn't need to be entirely true. It needed to be believable enough to give the emperor a concrete grievance to act on, and specific enough to feel like intelligence rather than manipulation. The emperor took the bait, his suspicion toward Elohim's ambitions in the region already primed by years of simmering rivalry. Within days, what had been a cautious, non-committal meeting solidified into a genuine military alliance. The gluttonous emperor's considerable forces now bound to Yeon-woo's growing coalition heading into the coming conflict. With that alliance secured, the pieces Yeon-woo needed for the war ahead had finally fallen into place. His Shadow Legion, his mercenary forces, Bram's lingering influence, Hades' underworld connections, and now the Emperor's considerable military weight, all converging toward a single, inevitable confrontation over the remaining Soul Stones and the fractured territory the Summer Queen's death had left behind. Somewhere in that coming war sat answers Yeon-woo still didn't have, who truly controlled his brother's soul in whatever dimension it currently resided, what the Black King's chains actually wanted from him beyond violence, and what exactly Lana's warning about the Soul Stone's deeper significance actually meant for the tower's future. Standing at the edge of a war he'd spent a year building toward without fully realizing it, Yeon-woo understood one thing clearly. The vengeance that had brought him into this tower was finished. What came next was something larger and far more dangerous than a list of names in a dead man's diary. The war didn't announce itself with a declaration, it announced itself with silence. For 3 days after the alliance with the gluttonous emperor solidified, the fractured remnants of the old Red Dragon territory went quiet in a way that unsettled Yeon-woo more than open conflict would have. Factions that should have been jockeying for position instead pulled back behind their own walls, watching, waiting to see which of the tower's remaining powers would move first. Adora was the one who finally put words to what that silence meant. She found him on the Emperor's outer battlements, studying maps of the fractured dragon territories spread across a stone table, and told him plainly that quiet like this in tower politics never lasted. It was the held breath before a landslide, not an absence of danger. She was right within the week. Reports started arriving from scattered outposts, each one describing the same pattern. Smaller dragon-aligned clans, desperate to avoid being crushed between larger factions, beginning to pledge themselves hastily to whichever claimant seemed most likely to survive the coming purge. 3 distinct factions had emerged from the wreckage of the Summer Queen's collapse, each holding a portion of her old territory, each convinced their claim to the remaining Soul Stones was the rightful one. None of them, according to Lana's warning, actually understood what those stones truly represented. Yeon-woo spent those tense early days doing something unfamiliar to him. Not hunting, not executing, but building. He moved between his mercenary legion's camps, the Emperor's war councils, and Hanova's forge, coordinating a coalition large enough to survive contact with whichever faction proved most aggressive once the fighting actually started. Sasha noticed the shift in him before anyone said it aloud. She'd grown steadier since Bram's intervention. Color fully returned to her face, though she still flinched sometimes at loud noises in ways that told Yeon-woo her recovery wasn't only physical. One evening, while he reviewed troop positions by lamplight, she climbed into the chair across from him and asked, with the blunt honesty only children managed, whether he was going to disappear the way her father had. He set the maps down and told her the truth. He said he couldn't promise nothing would ever happen to him, because nobody honest could promise that. But he told her he wasn't climbing toward some far-off goal that kept him from her anymore. Whatever came next, she was already part of the reason he was fighting it. She seemed to accept that, in the quiet way children sometimes accepted things adults couldn't fully guarantee, and fell asleep in the chair before he finished his work. He carried her to bed himself that night, instead of asking Hanova to do it, something he hadn't allowed himself to do in the earlier, colder months of his hunt. The first real skirmish of the Civil War broke out along the eastern border of the fractured Red Dragon territory. 2 of the 3 claimant factions colliding over a resource-rich stretch of land neither was willing to concede. Yeon-woo's coalition hadn't been the target, but the fighting threatened to spill into Emperor-aligned territory if left unaddressed, and the Emperor made it clear he expected his new allies to help contain it. Yeon-woo led the response personally, Nike flying reconnaissance ahead of his ground forces, K9's reforged blade resting at his side for the first time in a real engagement since Hades had returned it to him. The weapon responded differently than anything he'd wielded before, carrying an underworld weight that seemed to pull the fight's momentum towards stillness and finality rather than chaos. The skirmish ended faster than either warring faction expected, Yeon-woo's Shadow Legion flanking both sides simultaneously, forcing a ceasefire neither claimant had the strength to refuse. He didn't take sides in their dispute. He simply made clear that continued fighting on that particular stretch of land would cost both factions more than either could afford, and let the threat of his growing coalition do the rest. It wasn't peace, it was a pause, bought through intimidation rather than diplomacy, and Yeon-woo understood it wouldn't hold long. That night, back at the Emperor's stronghold, Bram's presence manifested unexpectedly, weaker than Yeon-woo remembered from their last conversation, his form flickering slightly at the edges like a signal struggling to stay clear. He'd come with information, not comfort. He told Yeon-woo that the Soul Stones scattered across the dragon territories weren't simply artifacts of raw power, the way most factions assumed. They were fragments, he explained, of something far older and more dangerous, pieces of a shattered entity connected to a figure from stories predating the tower's founding, a being the oldest tower records referred to only in fragments as Lucifer. Yeon-woo asked what that meant practically for the war unfolding around him. Bram's answer wasn't reassuring. He said that whoever managed to gather enough of those fragments together risked more than gaining power. They risked waking something the tower's earliest architects had gone to considerable lengths to keep permanently scattered. He warned Yeon-woo, with what remaining strength he had left, that the coming war wasn't just about territory or vengeance anymore. Whoever won might inherit a problem far larger than a dead brother's diary had ever prepared either of them for. Before fading back into whatever quiet existence he retreated to between visits, Bram left him with one final piece of information. A location, deep in the most contested claimant's territory, where the largest known concentration of soulstone fragments had been gathering since the Summer Queen's fall. Whoever controlled that vault would hold the deciding advantage in the war still unfolding. Yeon-woo understood, standing alone after Bram's presence faded, that the vengeance which had defined his first year inside the tower had quietly transformed into something with far higher stakes than he'd ever intended to carry. He gathered his coalition's leadership the following morning. The Emperor, Adora, and Fante, representing the One-Horn tribe's continued support, Khan and Doyle now leading veteran units within his mercenary legion, Hanova overseeing supply and equipment from the rear. He laid out what Bram had told him, watching the weight of it settle across faces that had, until that moment, believed they were fighting a straightforward war over territory and succession. The Emperor, predictably, cared less about ancient prophecy and more about practical advantage, but even he understood the value in reaching that vault before a rival claimant did. He committed his forces fully, and by the following week, Yeon-woo's coalition had mobilized in full toward the contested territory Bram had identified. The march toward that vault would not be simple. Two hostile factions stood between Yeon-woo's forces and the fragments waiting at its center, both aware by now that a masked commander with terrifying personal strength and troubling underworld connections had entered the war in earnest. Whispers had already started spreading through the remaining dragon clans, connecting the coalition's masked leader to the string of executions that had rocked the tower's upper factions over the past year. A few, old enough to remember Artia's rise and fall firsthand, began to wonder if the resemblance in fighting style, in mannerism, in the exact cold precision of every kill attributed to this new threat, meant something more than coincidence. Adora voiced that suspicion herself one evening, walking beside him as the coalition's forces made camp on the war's edge. She asked directly, without her usual careful diplomacy, whether he intended to keep wearing a mask forever, even after the people who mattered most had already guessed exactly who stood behind it. Yeon-woo didn't have a clean answer for her. The mask had started as a tool, a way to move unseen through a world that would have reacted very differently to a resurrected version of a man they'd already buried. Somewhere along the way, it had become something closer to armor, a barrier between the person he used to be and the person the tower had shaped him into. He told her, honestly, that he wasn't ready to answer that question yet. She accepted it without pushing further, the same patience she'd shown him since the archive on floor 11. And the two of them stood together at the edge of the camp, watching torchlight flicker across a war that was about to determine far more than either of them had originally signed up for. 2 days out from the vault Bram had identified, scouts brought word that changed the shape of everything. The two rival claimant factions, recognizing that neither could reach the vault before Yeon-woo's coalition arrived, had done the one thing nobody expected. They'd stopped fighting each other and combined their forces instead, forming a desperate, unstable alliance, aimed squarely at stopping the outside coalition before it could claim the fragments for itself. It was, in its own way, a mirror of everything Yeon-woo had spent the past year dismantling. Powerful factions banding together out of fear and self-interest, willing to set aside their differences the moment a greater threat forced their hand. The irony wasn't lost on him, neither was the danger. Combined, the two rival factions' remaining forces still outnumbered his coalition significantly, even with the Emperor's considerable military weight backing him. Winning a straightforward confrontation against that combined force would cost more than Yeon-woo was willing to spend, not with Sasha and Ananta waiting safely back at Hanova's forge, not with a coalition of people who'd trusted him with their loyalty rather than simply their fear. He needed an edge beyond raw numbers, and standing at the edge of the war camp that night, turning the Monkey King's divine iron fragment over in his palm, an idea began to take shape. One that would require him to finally test exactly what that fragment, and the fractured, unpredictable power still bound to his arm, were truly capable of. The combined enemy factions had already begun their march toward the same vault, according to the scouts' latest reports, their combined banners visible on the horizon by the following dawn. Whatever happened next would decide not just who claimed the remaining soul stones, but potentially whether those stones stayed safely scattered or found their way, piece by dangerous piece, back toward whatever entity the tower's oldest architects had worked so hard to keep broken apart. Yeon-woo stood at the front of his coalition's forces as the sun rose over the contested valley, Nike circling high above, K9 resting steady at his side, Sasha's safety and his brother's unfinished legacy both riding on whatever choice he made in the hours ahead. Somewhere beyond the enemy banners gathering on the horizon, the vault waited. And somewhere beyond that, unanswered still, waited the truth of exactly whose hands had been shaping this war from the shadows since long before Yeon-woo ever opened his brother's diary. The two armies began closing the distance between them, and the story of the tower's next chapter was about to begin.